China and Russia are not allies in the official technical meaning of the word, but they have this partnership. And what does that mean? It means that they're more than just friends. There is an acknowledgement that these two countries have a similar worldview and they have goals that are similar or that complement each other.
So what is this shared worldview? Where do they stand on issues?
Basically, what they want to see is a world that is reshaped when it comes to the global order. They don't like the fact that right now, if you look at the political landscape internationally, you have the US on top, and you have the US allies, Western European countries with a great deal of influence. But there's a great swathe of the international community who don't have their voices heard. But also what they're implying is a global order where the world is not run by Western democracies. And that kind of world order would definitely benefit China and Russia.
What is the relationship like between Putin and Xi Jinping? I've seen footage of them making dumplings together in China, viewing each other's military installations. It seems quite friendly.
Chinese President Xi Jinping calling Putin his, quote, best and bosom friend.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a bilateral bromance in a way.
The two enjoying a leisurely boat ride in St. Petersburg yesterday.
Presidents of China and Russia added a touch of panda to their diplomatic talks. Seeing the giant pandas at Moscow Zoo, though, China had given the pair of pandas to Russia during an earlier visit to symbolise their friendship.
President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin genuinely seem to have this great rapport. They've met 40 times at least.
Wow.
Vladimir Putin will say that President Xi Jinping is the only state leader that he celebrated his birthday with. And there's this very funny, albeit quite awkward, video clip of the two, cutting a cake and they're having their own conversation. Except, these are two very prominent world leaders. And they both have a very power-oriented dictatorship style to their leadership.
Do you remember about 1 year ago how the invasion of Ukraine was reported in China? What do you remember hearing?
I think people were just shocked. There was a lot of speculation and a lot of questions. Did Vladimir Putin tell Xi Jinping? Surely he would have told Xi Jinping. I mean, maybe he would have gotten Xi Jinping's blessing before all of this went down. And actually there was this prevailing argument that Russia is so not beholden to China, but obviously the junior partner in this relationship, that it would have been disrespectful for Vladimir Putin not to run this by President Xi Jinping. But the fact that this has dragged on so long, I think it becomes less likely that there would have been some sort of discussion or agreement between China and Russia that this was the plan to go ahead.
So then I think it's safe to say that that relationship and the partnership between the two countries has been put to the test since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, especially given that international sanctions have caused a huge dent in the Russian economy.
The economic sanctions leveled against Russia by the U.S. and its allies are the harshest ever handed down.
Many retailers have closed their doors as Western companies exit a country waging an illegal war.
So how important has China been in filling that gap?
China has been hugely important. I think there has been a measure of success in US and Western European efforts to isolate Russia, to turn it into this pariah that nobody wants to do business with, except Russia has, of course, there's no limits, partnership with China. So when you've seen all these other countries, specifically Europe, kind of turn their back away from Russia, China has not only stayed put, it's actually moved forward. It's extended and expanded its trade with Russia, especially when it comes to things that will benefit China. And we're talking here cheap energy.
Russia has also become China's top supplier of crude oil. Similar patterns have emerged in natural gas and coal.
Russia is a huge provider for China when it comes to oil and gas, and that's something China badly needs.
But China is also facing a delicate balance between supporting and benefiting from its Russian partner and getting hit by the same Western sanctions.
China has been very, very careful in terms of what it does technically in the language it uses. So China never wants to put itself in a position where it says it's aiding, for example, Russia's war effort. That China has very clearly expanded its trade with Russia. We've seen Russia purchase more Chinese goods, Chinese technology, for example, and Russia has become quite dependent on China for that.
So as the second largest economy in the world, could sanctions be an even larger risk for China than they are for Russia right now?
Absolutely. And I think you've touched on a very clear distinction between Russia and China. For all the similarities that there are between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, there is a huge difference in that China is a far more developed economy, and China relies on its ability to trade with a lot of these countries that have turned their back on Russia. China needs Europe. China needs the US much more than China needs Russia. So China has to be very careful, and it cannot be seen to be breaking these sanctions. That would be way too risky. Opinion is divided as to what extent China is doing that, but officially, China says that it is not crossing that line.
And interestingly, I mean, you said that China needs the US. The US also arguably needs China as well. So with that in mind, do you ever envision a scenario where the US and its allies could go to that step of wanting to sanction Chinese assets and Chinese authorities?
I think they're watching very closely, and we had all sorts of accusations from Washington saying that China is considering providing lethal aid.
U.S. officials warn Beijing may soon supply weapons to Russia to use in Ukraine.
The U.S. government says Russia will run out of serviceable ammunition this year unless they get help. Help, the U.S. and NATO say, could come from China.
Now, China basically rubbished those claims and said that was just a smear, basically hyped up fiction is what Beijing calls it. But we have also had researchers in the US who have pointed out that there has been trade between Russia and Chinese firms, where Chinese firms are explicitly providing technology that is used in Russian weaponry and Russian helicopters, for example. Now, whether or not you can draw the line and say that this is what Beijing is explicitly and intentionally doing, that's another question. But it does become very blurry as to whether they are breaking sanctions.
And Katrina says this threat of international sanctions and isolation comes at a time when China is especially vulnerable.
We have to remember that China, for its own part, is not in the best position. It's come out of 3 years of zero COVID. Its economy is slowing.
China is reopening again, but the Chinese economy is struggling to bounce back. Beijing faces a revenue shortfall of close to $1 trillion.
These are really big problems for China. It's actually trying to reach out to the world community and say, we're still here, we're a responsible partner, we're an alternative to the US. But it's also aligned itself with troublemaker number one in the international community. So that's not helping China's cause.
I've been talking to Al Jazeera's Beijing correspondent Katrina Yu about China's self-described no-limits relationship with Russia. And even through a year of conflict, Katrina says, outwardly, there seems to be no regrets from the Chinese side. It's just the opposite.
We've seen over the last few months, Beijing just dig its heels in when it comes to this relationship. We've heard so many different phrases. I think the most recent we've had is rock solid, that this is a rock solid friendship, and that China is not moving, no matter how it looks that this will be an extended war or whether Russia seems to be losing or whatever.
In fact, just before the one-year anniversary of the Ukraine invasion, while the U.S. president was in Kyiv, China sent its top diplomat, Wang Yi, to Moscow. There he met with Russian officials, including Vladimir Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
Relations are mature and rock solid. China is willing to work with Russia to firmly defend respective national territories and national interests.
What do we know about how the Chinese people feel about the war in Ukraine, and how might they feel about their country becoming more involved?
It's always difficult to know exactly what people in China think because China's social media is so tightly controlled and censored. We have to remember that China's state media is also controlling the narrative about how they're presenting this. They're not presenting this as an invasion of Ukraine. They're using the same language that Russia's state media is using. They're calling this Russia's special military operation. And when they report on this, they're not reporting on it as Russia is the aggressor.
Right.
So there are many people who do support Russia's effort in Ukraine. They buy the story that, this is originally a part of Russia and it's within their rights to do this. And they want to see Russia succeed. So it's really difficult to see the complete picture, although we do know state media is still very careful not to portray Russia as the bad guy. And I think what is interesting as well is that now the conversation has evolved into what China is getting from Russia, despite this being a huge reputational disaster for China's PR campaign in the global community. China does get a lot. So we talked about cheap oil and gas, which is crucial for China's energy security. But China also gets a peaceful northern border with a neighbor where they've had a very complicated history. There has been fighting. So that's one big thing. China also gets this big international distraction. Suddenly, China is not for the US enemy or focus number one. It's actually quite convenient that the eyes of Europe and the eyes of the US are on this fighting in Ukraine. It gives China a little more space, or at least breathing room, to do what it likes in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, for example. And also, it gets Russia, this very solid and reliable friend, in its corner when it comes to backing China at the UN over various issues, be it Xinjiang, Hong Kong, you name it. So they need each other. And that is also a marriage of convenience.
So it's sort of my enemy of my enemy is my friend type situation here.
Exactly. Exactly.
When we talk about that relationship, it's the same on the other side as well. The West has come out with strong words of support for Ukraine and has said that they will stand with Kyiv for as long as it takes. Based on what we see now, are all signs pointing to China also being ready to help Moscow for as long as it takes?
I don't see China backing away from the support that it's already offered Moscow when it comes to trade, when it comes to moral support on the international stage. I don't think that is going to change. The question of whether China is going to deliberately aid Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that's a very complex calculation that President Xi Jinping will have to make. That doesn't mean that it's going to find some other way to maybe skirt around sanctions, to maybe support Russia in every other way that it possibly can. But should it choose to go forward, I think that would be a really significant step with very real ramifications for China.
China has also now come out with this 12-point proposal for how to negotiate peace.
Beijing has presented a proposal to end the conflict, urging Ukraine and Russia to agree a ceasefire and hold peace talks as soon as possible.
Beijing is calling for an end to Western sanctions on Russia, and it suggests creating humanitarian corridors for civilians, as well as steps to ensure grain can be safely exported from Ukraine.
Did that surprise you? And do you think that China can or even wants to play a role as mediator?
I think China definitely wants to play a role as mediator. China uses every opportunity it can to criticize any efforts on the global stage that is led by the US and specifically by US partners. China says that model does not take into account the different voices in the world, especially in the developing countries. And it definitely sees itself as more able to be a mediator than, say, the US, for example, because the US is very directly aiding Ukraine, whereas China has said time and time again that
it was quite a difficult day yesterday for the whole country, for the whole, for all regions of Ukraine, as this massive attack happened over the night and particularly early in the morning. But in the evening, it was another bad shelling of the city of Zaporizhia. And just to mention, the city of Zaporizhia is located basically in between of Donetsk and Kherson region. So it's kind of, in the middle of two front lines. And it has quite a strategic location. And also this is the reason why the shelling of Zaporizhia is happening very often and also intensifies. And what we know from this particular shelling in the evening that bad damages of energy infrastructure. It caused bad damages of energy infrastructure, and thousands of Zaporizhzhia citizens remain without electricity. Also, very difficult situation with electricity remains in the city of Kharkiv. After yesterday attack, energy infrastructure damages caused outages in the city of Kharkiv, and still thousands of Kharkiv residents remain without electricity. However, the water supply was back. But still, probably these two areas are suffering the most at this point of time from the outcomes of these attacks. In terms of central part of the country, there are some areas which also remain quite tough in terms of energy supply and outages.
What's the latest with Bakhmut? The last we heard, it sounded like it could fall to the Russians. Is that what you're hearing?
Well, situation in Bakhmut and around Bakhmut remains extremely tough. The Ukrainian armed forces confirm that situation is very difficult. There is no particularly official confirmation of the fact that Ukrainians are leaving, and for the moment, what we see and what we hear is that it might be that Ukrainian forces are kind of moving the defense lines, but no official information about leaving the city of Bakhmut. So Ukrainian forces, at this point of time, according to official sources, remain in the city. However, there is a certain advance from the Russian forces in that area, especially in the east part of that region of the city of Bakhmut. Also, today, Maxar Technologies images appeared, new images of the area appeared publicly, and we can see from that images that actually the bridges over the main river in the city of Bakhmut are destroyed. And also, we can see a lot of damages in the eastern part of the city, which is apparently under Russian control. At least this is what Russian forces announced. Again, we don't have confirmation from Ukrainian side on that, but images demonstrate that east part of the city of Bakhmut is pretty much destroyed, almost completely. What we also hear from Ukrainian officials that definitely the defense of the city of Bakhmut is the longest defense fight, keeping Bakhmut of this full-scale invasion, and gives time for Ukrainian forces to prepare to the upcoming counteroffensive. At least this is what we're hearing here on the ground.
Anna Chernikova reporting for VOA from Kyiv. While there's no knowing when the war in Ukraine will be over, one volunteer organization in western Ukraine called Lviv Knights has been working since 2014 to try to help restore old historical buildings that might have suffered from military action, and at the same time help Ukrainian soldiers by collecting whatever equipment they can. Omilyan El-Shudlak has the story from Lviv, Ukraine.
Some wood, an open fire, and a pot means a new roof for an old Ukrainian church. Inside the pot, there's some used motor oil. Tapered pieces of wood are being boiled in the mixture to make them waterproof, turning them into new shingles for the church roof.
My grandfather once taught me that a shingle is worth as much as a loaf of grey bread. We have 22,000 shingles for the church.
Despite the war, entrepreneurs, psychologists, financiers, journalists, students, teachers, architects, restorers, and prosecutors gather in the suburbs of Lviv every month to save this wooden church. Since 2013, Andriy Saluk, together with friends, has been trying to save the church through public donations. To protect the building from moisture, they covered the church with a special film and restored its belfry.
I like to climb the belfry and watch the scenery.
A cloud of black smoke could be seen from the belfry a few days after Russian missiles fell on energy facilities only 10 kilometers from the church. Saluk's volunteer group, Lviv Knights, started helping Ukraine's armed forces back in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. They sent night vision devices, thermal imagers, binoculars, monoculars, scopes, periscopes, weather stations, drones, and sometimes cars to the front lines. It's not much, Saluk says, but every little bit helps. Saluk got his first volunteer experience in 1990 during the Revolution of Granite, one of the first large-scale student protests in Kiev in the Soviet era. Saluk provided protesters camping in what is now known as Independence Square, with tents and sleeping bags. Today, he encouraged his social media followers to donate damaged thermal imagers. The Lviv Knights know how to repair equipment.
And when guys call you at 5 a.m. and say, you know, they tried to sneak by us at night, but we noticed them. Otherwise, the 12 of us would not have been alive. You know our efforts are worth it.
From sleeping bags to thermal imagers, whatever is needed. Saluk says he will work to get it to Ukrainian fighters on the front lines until the war is over. Omeliano Shudlak for VOA News, Lviv, Ukraine.
Ukrainians who fled the war to find temporary refuge in the U.S. are now facing the end of their permission to stay, known as humanitarian parole. And many say the uncertainty is causing them stress. From the Associated Press, Karen Shamas reports.
About 20,000 Ukrainians are coming to the end of their humanitarian parole. The majority of them arrived in the United States through Mexico. There, it was easier and faster to get a visa to enter the country in the first months following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Biden administration has said it is working on a fix, but so far has issued no official guidance on what Ukrainians should do. I'm Karen Chamas.
Russia's war in Ukraine has added to Pakistan's woes as its import-dependent economy has suffered price shocks. 1 year later, Islamabad not only continues to maintain a neutral diplomatic stance on Russia, it's also trying to deepen trade ties with Moscow to acquire cheap energy. Sarah Zaman reports on how Pakistan is walking a diplomatic tightrope in this conflict.
Russia's war in Ukraine derailed Ali Hasnan's plan to acquire an affordable foreign degree in medicine. Hasnan was among hundreds of Pakistani students who fled Ukraine when Russian tanks rolled in.
I am not in touch with anyone in Ukraine because of the conditions there. I applied for admission to med school in Pakistan too, but could not succeed due to the high grades required here.
Russia's war put Pakistan in a difficult position on the world stage. Images of then Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow on the day Russian forces entered Ukraine embarrassed Islamabad. As supply disruptions pushed up food and fuel prices around the world, Pakistan's import-dependent economy, already beleaguered by the COVID-19 pandemic, devastating floods, and mounting debt, faced increasing pressure. Despite calling for peace, Pakistan, like a few dozen other countries, continued to abstain from voting on US-led UN resolutions that condemned Russian aggression.
I think the broader dynamic was that Pakistan wanted to maintain good ties with all major powers. The question arose essentially in the context of US-China competition, but I think the point was well made that we want to have good ties with US, with China, but also with Russia and all other powers.
Driven by growing food insecurity, Pakistan increased wheat imports from Russia. As its neighbor and arch-rival India ramped up cheap energy imports from Moscow to a record high, Pakistan pushed for discounted Russian oil and gas as well. The two sides may reach a formal deal late in March. Ukraine's ambassador to Pakistan, Markian Chuchuk, says Islamabad's policy of staying neutral in the conflict while doing business with Russia is ultimately helping Moscow.
A responsible country should not turn a blind eye to the fact that in doing business with Russia, it may support waging war through oil money.
Ukraine, a major supplier of wheat to Pakistan, saw bilateral trade drop 73% as its exports came under Russian attacks.
If Pakistan condemns Russian aggression against Ukraine, it doesn't mean that it becomes a puppet of the West. That may be a position of a sovereign state.
Chaudhry says Pakistan is exercising autonomy but not taking sides. With the war now in its second year, Pakistan continues to walk a diplomatic tightrope. But Hasnan says he is ready to pick a new path.
I'm quitting the idea of medicine and going to Australia to study business.
With Ali Furqan and Gaitiar Anis, Sarah Zaman, VOA News, Islamabad.
Sarah Ashton Cirillo used to be a journalist based in Los Angeles. A transgender woman, she is now a military medic in Ukraine's armed forces. Tatiana Vorozhko met with her in Washington in early December when she came to brief U.S. lawmakers and experts on developments on the front lines.
American Sarah Ashton Cirillo came back to the US for the first time after spending 9.5 months in Ukraine. Ashton Cirillo, a transgender woman and former journalist, originally headed to Ukraine to report on Russia's invasion. She recalled being nervous crossing the Ukrainian border as a transgender woman.
Because there were problems with my paperwork regarding my gender transition, and also I wasn't certain how Ukrainians would deal with having a transgender reporter reporting from the country during war.
Ashton Cirillo says her experience in Ukraine changed her views on how a society can perceive the LGBTQ community.
From the first day when I entered, when I had my passport stamped, I found Ukraine to be welcoming in a very unique way. It's not a question of tolerance, it's not a question of identity. What it is that Ukraine is a nation that appreciates liberty and freedom for all people. And that allowed me to work at an ever higher efficiency as a writer and now as a soldier, due to the fact that my gender identity is a non-issue.
A June analysis published by the U.S. Institute of Peace says while Ukraine has made progress on LGBTQ rights, such as welcoming gay people into its armed forces, more work is needed. Studies indicate attitudes in Ukraine are changing. A 2019 Pew survey in Ukraine said 69% of those polled said homosexuality should not be accepted by society, while 14% said it should be. 3 years later, in May 2022, a survey by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology reported that 64% of respondents said LGBTQ citizens in Ukraine should have equal rights. 26% disagreed. In March, Ashton Cirillo made it to Kharkiv, covering the city and the region for the LGBTQ Nation publication and her Twitter and Substack.
But under President Zelensky and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, what I found is I had more freedom as a reporter in Ukraine under martial law than I would trying to even film the police in the United States.
After seeing the war firsthand, Ashton Cirillo applied to join Ukraine's armed forces.
And then finally, day after day after day of being attacked, made the war personal for me. And due to this, I understood what more could I do? How could I do more in this fight for liberty on behalf of Ukraine than actually be willing to go to the front, not just as a journalist, not just as a civilian working for the Ukrainian government, but as a soldier myself.
Ashton Cirillo has a medical background and was offered work in a medical unit. She was sent to CCC training, a NATO standard medical training course for combat medics, which she passed. She is now waiting to be sent to the front lines as a military medic.
The front lines are a hellacious place. Line 0 is a hellacious place. I've been there when ambulances have been destroyed.
The U.S. Congress passed nearly $45 billion in additional aid for Ukraine, part of a $1.7 trillion spending bill. It now goes to President Joe Biden, who will sign it into law. Ashton Cirillo says Ukraine has already won by showing its bravery and Russia's military impotence. But she hopes the U.S. will continue to help Ukraine reach victory. Tetiana Voroshko, VOA News, Washington.
Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a nonprofit called World Central Kitchen has been helping the Ukrainian people stay well-fed. On the war's first anniversary, the organization's founder, Jose Andreas, came to the Kyiv region in person. Anna Kostuchenko met with the world-famous chef.
Hot soup, some fish and potatoes, salads and desserts. This is what volunteers from the non-profit World Central Kitchen prepared for residents of Irpin in the Kyiv region as the war in Ukraine entered its second year. Chef Jose Andres, World Central Kitchen's founder, is here as well.
But yes, it's an anniversary of hope. Obviously, with the visit of President Biden, it's a message of hope.
Since then, volunteers have been serving hot meals.
That's why at the end we ended in more than 1,000 towns and cities. We had more than 8,000 food distributions a week. We reached 550,000 hot meals a day. We reached 1.2 million meals on top of that on the form of food bags in places, rural areas with no infrastructure, with no supermarkets.
Russian forces destroyed over 10,000 houses in Irpin last spring, forcing many to move to temporary modular towns. One such town is on the premises of a former sanatorium, and its 300-plus residents, as well as low-income residents of Irpin and Bucha, receive meals daily from World Central Kitchen. For some of them, it is the only way to feed their children.
Our apartment burned down. We lived in a wagon for 6 months, and in late November we moved here.
Music producer Sergei Krivtsov has been volunteering here since June. With the music industry in Ukraine on pause, he spends all his time helping others.
I saw on our friends' Instagram pages they're doing this. I got a chance to help for a few days and then quickly joined the team full-time because they're so good.
Andres says it was a sense of unity and willingness of Ukrainians to help each other that impressed him the most when he came to Ukraine.
Everybody's behind one idea. Everybody's behind President Zelensky. Even people didn't vote for him, they tell you, I didn't vote for him, but he's my president now.
Since the start of the war, Andres has spent over 100 days in Ukraine. He has also visited the deoccupied cities of Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Kherson and others. Anna Kostychenko for VOA News, Irpin, Ukraine.
When Igor Ponochevny drew his first political cartoon, he was living in Russia and working at a bank. Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014 inspired him to draw under the pen name Alosha Stupin. VOA Russia spoke with the artist. Anna Rice narrates the story.
These political cartoons focusing on the war in Ukraine were done by Igor Ponochevny, who has been drawing them since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014.
When Crimea was annexed, it affected me a lot. As a trained lawyer, I realized Russia has entered some dark times, and the consequences for the country will be horrible. I was trying to imitate a kid's drawing. I was trying to show how ecstatic the Russian people were about the annexation, and how critical I was. I wanted to mock what I saw.
Ponochevny published his work under the pen name Alosha Stupin, a 7-year-old Russian boy who draws the world around him.
I chose the pen name Alyosha because it sounds very sweet, a nice diminutive name. Last name, Stupin, was chosen because I saw it as blend between Putin and the English word stupid. So this name was born and felt right for me.
In 2014, Ponochevny left his job at the bank and started drawing. Every day.
I wasn't scared of the authorities, but I was scared of people who served the regime. Many, in their desire to suck up to the regime, who tried to punish me for what I was doing. At the time, people seemed euphoric, and any attempts to disagree with them were seen as a personal attack. For them, I was an enemy.
In 2015, Ponochevny moved from Russia to the US, where he continued to draw, but this time without fear. Today he lives in San Francisco, where he draws murals and political cartoons on the conflict in Ukraine.
The symbol of modern Russia is a sledgehammer. Here, I drew it as a monument to the horrors that are happening now. And here, it's pretty obvious. We can see the church sending people to their death.
Церковь посылает на убой